2022 has been a great year for video games, and we've seen many releases, but one that stood out to me was the title Sifu, developed by Slowclap, published by Kepler Interactive. The game sold over 500,000 units within just 3 days and received great praise, especially for its combat system. How did the team manage to create such a convoluted yet satisfying combat system? Let's hear it from Slowclap's game and combat designer, Théo Caselli, who spearheaded the game and the design and many of the core combat mechanics that made Sifu an indie success story. Welcome to the stage.
So, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Sifu with the subtitle How to Learn, Harder to Master, with a presentation focused on design. So, a quick rundown. So I'm going to repeat a bit of information, but my name is Théo Caselli. I'm from Slowclap. I've worked there as a combat designer for more than 3 years. And a quick rundown of Sifu. So Sifu is a third-person beat 'em up. The game is focused on martial arts and their philosophy, told through a revenge story. And it was released earlier this year. So, let's get into the meat of the subject. If you've worked in game design, you've most certainly heard the saying, easy to learn, hard to master. It's a fine guideline, a very important guideline. It means that your game is accessible, yet satisfying to master. But for Sifu, we didn't really try to follow this guideline. Especially the easy to learn part. So, in this presentation, I want to go into more details about how did we manage to appeal to a large audience despite having a hard-to-learn combat system. And appeal might not be the right word here, because I'm going to talk about the combat design. So for the players that already bought the game, for the casual players that want to progress with the game, how did we keep them engaged? And I want to focus on two parts. First is the impact of the fantasy, and secondly, the fact that the game is very hard, but still fair. And before going into it, I want to answer a small question, which is, why in the first place didn't we make a game easy to learn, hard to master? And the answer lies in the core intentions and the core pillar of the combat system. First of all, we wanted to create a game about Kung Fu. So Kung Fu is a very important theme for the design and everything. If you've seen the game, you know what I'm talking about. But also for the game design part, because we wanted to push the philosophy of learning by doing. The player will struggle and will have to overcome these struggles. And the second point, which made the Sifu kind of a special game, is the credibility and the importance of having real hand-to-hand combat represented in the game. So, because throwing or receiving a punch in real life is absolutely not trivial, so we wanted to represent this in the game. It influenced the animations, of course, but also the game design by creating an unforgiving gameplay where a small mistake can cost the player their whole run. So, with these intentions, we attracted two types of players. First, we had the hardcore players, the fan of action games in general, the Sekiro players, the From Software players, that are interested by the gameplay intentions, the fact that they will have to struggle, they will have to overcome some challenges. But on the other hand, we also attracted a lot of martial arts fans that find something that they didn't really found in the market, like a realistic hand-to-hand combat. And there is overlap between those two categories of players. But there is a lot of martial arts fans that are not used to a demanding gameplay like what we have in Sifu. So this presentation is about how we keep those martial arts fans engaged in the game. And which leads us to our first part, the impact and the importance of the martial art fantasy. And more precisely, how do we manage to stay true to our fantasy with an immersive and coherent combat system? The first point is that the player will be able to naturally create choreographies. And to do that, all the in-game actions that are available to the player or the AIs, we took film sequences and decomposed them, define actions and put them into the game. Like here, you can see an example with the red, where the character uses various defensive options, and you can find them in the game. So the player will very naturally be able to recreate fight sequences that they've seen in movies. Then we use references for the authenticity, because we have a lot of martial arts in the game, and we wanted to stay authentic to what we show in the game. And for that, we took references that range from YouTube videos and martial demonstrations that you can find on Instagram to a real-life consultant that helped us for the main character and the various possibilities. Because our goal was not only to represent cool attacks or cool actions, but present what would real martial arts look like if they would use efficiently in a fight. Then we have a lot of details and polish. And there is many examples of this through the game, but I want to focus on two specific here to create a fluid fight sequence. First is the hit reactions. So hit reaction is the animation that is played by a character when he gets hit. So fairly simple. But the idea is that hit reaction needs to be impactful and believable. So our animators worked on a very big package of hit reactions so that every hit really has an impact. And then we have the back-turns attack. So this one is interesting because most of the fights in Sifu are in 1v(n), meaning that the player will have to deal with multiple enemies at the same time. So they most likely will have to turn around to attack enemies behind them or something like that. So for each and every attack of the main character, we created a small alternative version that allows a smooth transition with attacking a backward opponent. So this creates a very fluid combat, as you can see in this small video. And the goal with this is that we wanted to avoid any weird behaviors, anything that might look a bit strange for the player or something that could pull them out of the game. And then we can quickly talk about the cinematography and the camera, more specifically. We wanted to keep the player close to the action, so we worked with an over-the-shoulder camera. And the player, by using specific action, can trigger dynamic movements that add a layer of cinematography to the game. Our goal with the camera was to create a really immersive experience for the player. And the result of all this work is that the combat always conveys our fantasy, meaning that a cool-looking fight is not gated by the player performance. Even if they're mashing or they're getting beat up, like you can see here, the combat still looks good. And the player doesn't have to master or really understand the game to enjoy a pleasant-looking fight. Which leads us to a second part, creating a game hard but still fair. So fair can mean a lot of things. But for us in Sifu, it means creating a game where the player never feels helpless, where the player never feels like they're out of option. And the most important part, maybe, of this is the responsive controls. And again, there is a lot of details to responsive controls, but here I want to focus on the cancels and the ability of the player to cancel specific actions. So in Sifu, whenever the player attacks, they always have the option to cancel what they're doing with a defensive options, meaning that they can always react to an incoming attack. This makes that the player is always in control of their character. They can always, it's all about reaction and timing. They never lose control. Then we have a very versatile and base move kit. So the player has many options at his disposal, and all those options allow them to deal with any situation possible. We have, of course, the crowd control options. Here you can see the focus at the beginning of the video that allows them to paralyze an enemy for a short amount of time, but it also has defensive options and movement options that allow them to regain space. The idea is that if the player fails a situation, maybe outside of bosses, but if the player fails the situation, they can always ask themselves, why didn't I use in this fight? And they might find an answer to the situation that they failed. Okay, so this one is a bit of a tricky one, because in Sifu, as mentioned in the introduction, we wanted to create a realistic fight. And realistic fight implies realistic enemies and credible enemies. But credible enemies means that enemies will not wait for their turn. They will try to pincer attack the main character. And this can create a lot of completely unmanageable situations, unsolvable situations for the player. So we try to put a lot of safeguards. There is some subtle one and some more obvious. And here you have two examples. First of all the attacks in the game are fairly reactable. The player has all the time in the world to see an incoming attack, meaning that an attentive player will never be caught off guard. Then we have the fact that the player, the main character, might get stuck in an animation. So when they get stuck, we stop all the incoming attacks to avoid any checkmate situation for the player. The idea is that we still have realistic enemies, but we try to keep them fair. We try to keep them in line, you know. And the last point is the digestible patterns. It's kind of linked with the point before, but the idea is that the player will have to learn patterns to progress through the game. So our goal was to create interesting patterns, but digestible one. So we kind of had to really tread carefully while creating patterns. We try to avoid creating unreactable random because it can confuse the players that's trying to learn a pattern. We try to avoid abrupt rhythm changes. The rhythm can be a make or break situation for a pattern. And having many abrupt rhythm changes can just create something that is not pleasant to deal with for the player. And finally, since the player has to learn them, we created fairly short patterns. The idea is that by just playing the game, the player should be able to naturally learn and adapt and develop habits to their enemies. And all this make that the player is, how should I say this? Like, the player is never completely stuck. They always have an answer. The game, all these small elements create kind of short-term goal for the player. And completing this goal pushes them to persevere in the game. It's kind of our own get-good mentality. Like, the player has to ask themselves, okay, why didn't I use? Why didn't I see? And they have to blame themselves instead of blaming the game. And we push them through this direction. So, for us, a core part of Sifu's experience is creating a game that is fairly hard, but really interesting to master. And simplifying the game was never an option for us. It was all about how do we push the player to figure things out in the game. So our fantasy kind of acts as a bait. It keeps the player engaged in the game. And it keeps them despite the frustration. It also creates a very clear goal. Like when you see a cool fight sequence in Sifu, you know what you have to do. You have to create your perfect fight. And we give them the tool to do that with all the gameplay elements and our balancing. We try to really push our casual audience to have some kind of a hardcore mentality to complete the game. So this presentation is now finished. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them.
What an amazing game you've created. Love that talk. And it seems like we already got some questions pouring in here. How do you blend combat and storytelling? A lot of your presentation was more on the combat side, but how do you marry those two things together?
So this was a very interesting topic because during the development for us, story was kind of push, a bit behind the combat, of course. So we wanted to still have some kind of narrative idea in the combat. So the most important one is that we're doing a kind of a tale of revenge. And we wanted the player to feel the brutality of a main character driven by revenge. So we worked on the animations and the attacks that we designed to really have this, this rage. Like you can feel the rage of the character. He kills his enemies. So we use this kind of tricks to really tell our story in the game. And there is many examples of that. So the main character it might be the most obvious one, yeah.
Got it. Okay, next one. How do you manage challenge level in the easy mode compared to the normal mode?
Okay, so I didn't go into too much details during the presentation, but we have some kind of domination gauge available for the player. This domination gauge is an hidden factor that defines if the player is doing well or is doing bad in the combat. And we use this to define the easy mode. Like in the easy mode, we always assume that the player is doing very poorly. So some enemies don't have access to some of their move kit. The player has more health, and they're also less aggressive.
Got it. Okay, is that Bruce? Oh my goodness. Bruce Lee asks, didn't know that Bruce Lee uses Slido. Are you or any of the team members a practitioner of any form of Chinese martial arts to be confident, that you are creating an authentic experience?
So me personally, no, but our creative director practice Pak-Mei, which is the main Chinese martial arts used in the game. And it's through his practice session that he had the idea for the game. So yeah, it was very important, and we had a lot of members that go to the same lessons because it's near the studio. So yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Adam from Pixelland Games asked, how much time did you spend on prototyping combat gameplay?
Okay, so we never finished. We worked until the end of the development to prototype a new idea with some tools that was done in the combat. So even with the gold and the patch day one, there is some small elements that we try out in Zoo. Sorry. So yeah, we never stopped prototyping combat gameplay. The more interesting part is how did we define the tools that we use to prototype the combat gameplay? And here we had a lot. I could do a presentation about it, but we had a lot of tools, and most of them come from the previous game, Absolver.
Excellent. You mentioned combat moves were inspired from movies. So was mocap used to replicate the same moves and animations for your game?
So mocap was only used for cinematics and takedown actions. So the takedowns are like the finisher move of the game. Everything else is done by keyframes. So be it the attacks or the locomotion, everything is done by keyframes.
Got it. And how did you ensure enemies telegraph their attacks clearly while still keeping the game at the right difficulty?
So through iteration. Like you don't have many ways to do that. You just have to try your first time. Like we have some basis notions, If you're familiar with frames, like with frame data, we try to always have an enemy's attack within at least 25 frames. Because the reaction time for normal people playing a game is 20 frames. So we try to start at 25. And then we expand on that to see if the attack is not telegraphed enough, if players tend to get hit by it, or even us gets hit by it. That's the issue.
I would love to talk about frames even longer. But Yat asks, was it easier to develop Sifu after developing Absolver? What did you improve or change from the previous title?
So I didn't personally work on Absolver, but I used some of the tools that we had for Absolver, and I can talk for maybe the other people from the team, but it's not easier or harder. It's just different, very different. Like we didn't have the online problematics, the online issues, but we had other issues that we had to deal with. So again, what did we improve or change from the previous title? It's kind of hard to answer, since there is not the same issues or ideas in the game. Like one is for PvP, is focused PvP and player versus player, while the other one is more of a single-player game where we want to create cool-looking fights.
Well, Théo, it looks like there's so many more questions waiting for you. We really enjoyed that presentation. Again, love all the inspiration you've taken from the fighting movies and the fighting games. Awesome stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.